9:17 a.m. over the Pacific. American bombers open their bay doors at 20,000 feet. 40 seconds later, nothing. Japanese destroyers simply turn and sail on. Precision bombing has failed. So one general asks a forbidden question: what if we put a tank cannon on an airplane? At 9:17 a.m., the bomb bay doors closed and the American crews leaned forward in their seats, counting the seconds. 40 of them. That's how long a bomb takes to fall from 20,000 feet. 40 seconds of hope. 40 seconds of belief in math manuals, in the promise of modern air power. Below them, Japanese destroyers cut through the Solomon Sea in perfect formation, gray steel, slicing blue water. The Norden bomb sites said, "This should work." The calculations were flawless. Wind drift corrected. Release levers pulled. Then the ocean erupted not in fire, but in harmless white plumes. Every bomb missed, not by inches, but by hundreds of yards. The destroyers didn't scatter. They didn't panic. Their captains simply watched, ordered a calm turn, and sailed on untouched. It happened again and again, day after day. Millions of dollars in bombs, fuel, and aircraft splashed uselessly into the Pacific, while the Tokyo Express ran supplies straight to the front lines. The future of warfare the Army had promised was precision bombing. Out here, that future was a lie. The truth was brutal, and it had nothing to do with courage or skill. It was physics. A bomb dropped from high altitude takes nearly a full minute to reach the sea. In that minute, a destroyer moving at 30 knots can change its position by half a mile. Japanese captains knew this. They watched the American bombers climb, saw the bay doors open, and simply waited. When the bombs fell, they turned, clean, effortless, almost bored. What was supposed to be impossible was happening every day. The U.S. Army Air Forces had built an entire doctrine on the idea that altitude meant safety and accuracy. But over the Southwest Pacific, that doctrine was bleeding out. Crews flew home exhausted and empty-handed. Maintenance teams scavenged wrecks for spare parts. Morale sank with every missed attack. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers ran the slot like it belonged to them, unloading men guns and ammunition without a scratch on their hulls. This was the nightmare waiting on the desk of a new commander when he arrived in theater. Major General George Kenney didn't look like a man who worshipped manuals. He was short, blunt, and aggressive, more shop foreman than polished general. When he read the reports of high-altitude raids, he didn't debate them. He threw them away. Kenney understood the problem instantly. Trying to hit a warship from 20,000 feet was like dropping a marble from a skyscraper into a coffee cup being dragged by a sprinting cat. The enemy wasn't brave. They were just faster than gravity. If air power was going to matter in this war, it couldn't stay in the clouds. It had to go down into the spray, into the flak, right in front of the guns. And once Kenney reached that conclusion, the war in the Pacific was about to take a very dangerous turn. Getting lower was easy to say. Surviving it was another matter. At mast height, machine guns were useless. Rifle-caliber rounds skipped off destroyer hulls like gravel off armor. Kenney didn't need noise, he needed shock. He needed something that could tear into a boiler room, smash a bridge, and stop a ship now. That's when his eyes landed on the impossible. Sitting on airfield hardstands and in dusty depots was the Army's 75mm field gun, a brute born in World War I designed to crack bunkers and punch through tanks. It fired a 15-pound shell with enough force to wreck concrete and steel. On land, it was bolted to the earth. In tanks, 30 tons of armor absorbed its kick. In an airplane, it had no business being there. Kenny didn't care. He looked at the B-25 Mitchell, a tough, overbuilt medium bomber, and saw not a bomber, but a delivery system. The idea was pure madness. Rip off the glass nose, shove a tank cannon into the front of a twin-engine aircraft, and fly it straight at a warship. The weight alone was a nightmare. The recoil was worse. When engineers ran the numbers, the results screamed red. They warned the blast would shear rivets, shatter cockpit glass, stall, the aircraft maybe tear the nose clean off. They called it a flying coffin. Kenny called it necessary. While engineers talked stress limits, Japanese destroyers were unloading troops. While slide rules argued physics, men were dying in the jungle. Kenny wasn't asking permission, he was issuing a verdict. The manuals went into the trash. He ordered the nose rebuilt in steel, the cockpit rearranged, and a man added whose sole job was to hand-load artillery shells in midair. It was a bet against physics, against doctrine, against common sense. And everyone involved knew that when the trigger was finally pulled, the airplane or the war was going to break first. The engineers didn't argue anymore. They warned, they documented, they predicted disaster in clean-typed pages filled with words like catastrophic failure and structural collapse. Then they were overruled. Orders came down, and the impossible became mandatory. A prototype would be built, not because anyone believed in it, but because the war demanded it. On factory floors and in sweltering Pacific hangars, the B-25 was mutilated. The elegant glass nose, once home to the bombardier, and his precision optics was sawed off like a limb. In its place went blunt steel, bolted and welded with brute force. Inside that steel snout, crews cradled the massive 75mm cannon. It was so large, the pilot could almost touch the breech from his seat. There was no automation, no elegance, just metal hydraulics and violence waiting to be unleashed. The aircraft's balance was ruined instantly. The nose sagged toward the ground like a wounded animal. To fix it, mechanics didn't consult aerodynamic charts. They bolted raw lead into the tail until the plane sat level again. It was ugly, heavy, wrong by every rule of flight. Test pilots reported it handled like a dump truck with wings. The sleek bomber was gone. What remained was something else entirely, a flying battering ram. Inside the cockpit, the changes were just as severe. The navigator station was ripped out. The bombardier was gone. In their place stood a new crewman with the most terrifying job in the Air Forces, the cannon loader. He would stand inches from the gun wrestle, 15-pound shells in turbulence, slam them home by hand, and brace for recoil that felt like a car crash. One mistake meant death. Rumors spread fast. Pilots joked the plane would fly backward when it fired. They called it the flying artillery. Beneath the laughter was fear. No one knew what would happen when that trigger was pulled for the first time. Would the wing stay on? Would the engine stall? Or would the aircraft simply disintegrate? In midair, there was no more room for theory. The next step wasn't a meeting, it was a takeoff. And once that cannon fired, there would be no walking the idea back. The test flight was a confession booth for everyone involved. There would be no excuses once the wheels left the runway. The modified B-25 lumbered forward engines, straining using nearly every foot of asphalt before clawing its way into the humid air. It climbed slowly, painfully, like it didn't want to fly at all. Every vibration felt wrong. Every groan of metal sounded like a warning. The target was a lonely coral reef off the coast, chosen because no one would die if the airplane tore itself apart. Inside the cockpit, the tension was suffocating. Sweat ran down backs despite the slipstream. The new crewman in the nose. The cannon loader gripped a 15-pound shell like a weightlifter before a deadlift. No powered rammer, no safety net, just muscle and timing. He shoved the round into the breech, slammed it shut, and shouted over the engines, "Gun ready." The pilot lined up the nose using a crude iron sight bolted to the dashboard. No bomb sight, no computer, just instinct. He steadied his hands and squeezed the trigger. The airplane didn't just fire, it stopped. For a split second, forward motion felt arrested, as if the B-25 had slammed into an invisible wall. The recoil hammered through the airframe with the violence of a collision. Rivets screamed. The cockpit filled with choking white smoke and the sharp bite of burned propellant. Teeth rattled. Vision vanished. Then the smoke cleared. The wings were still there. The engines were still turning. The control column still answered. And below them, the reef exploded water and pulverized coral erupting exactly where the nose had been pointed. Physics hadn't won. Fear hadn't won. The airplane had survived. On the ground, mechanics and engineers stared in stunned silence. The math had said this couldn't work. The reports had promised disaster. But the evidence was hanging in the air, still flying. The impossible had just become real. That single shot changed everything. It proved that a bomber could carry artillery, that recoil could be tamed, that doctrine could be broken. The question was no longer, can it fire? Now there was a far more dangerous one waiting to be answered. What happens when that cannon is aimed at a living firing warship that intends to kill you first? Proving it could fire was the easy part. Learning how to fight with it was something else entirely. Overnight, the rules of bombing were thrown out. A bomber was meant to be steady, predictable, a flying platform for falling explosives. This machine demanded the opposite. The cannon was fixed forward. It didn't swivel. It didn't forgive. To aim it, the pilot had to aim the entire airplane. That meant diving straight at the target. No weaving, no last-second jink, just a long, terrifying approach run directly into enemy guns. The pilots called it bore sighting, but it felt more like a game of chicken played at 200 miles an hour. On paper, the 75mm could reach out thousands of yards. In reality, no one trusted it beyond 1,000. To guarantee a hit, they had to get close enough to see details, railings, gun shields, faces. Training was relentless. Crews attacked old wrecks and abandoned hulks, learning the brutal rhythm of the run. Dive, steady, fire. Absorb the recoil. Recover, reload, fire again. If the loader was fast and didn't black out from G-forces, maybe 3 rounds per pass. This wasn't a machine gun. It was a sniper rifle with wings. Miss, and you had to circle back, exposing your belly to every gun on the ship. Inside the cockpit, teamwork became survival. The pilot flew and aimed. The co-pilot managed engines and called range. The loader worked like a piston shell. Up, breech, open, slam, lock, brace, load, fire, load, fire. Brass casings piled up on the floor, rolling underfoot with every maneuver. Hands blistered, muscles screamed. Fear was constant. The first real targets weren't destroyers. They were barges, small supply boats creeping along coastlines at dawn. and the results were immediate and shocking. Bombs often punched clean holes straight through wood without detonating. The 75mm didn't punch holes. It erased ships. One hit turned a barge into splinters, fuel, and fire. Crews came home wide-eyed, silent, realizing what they'd just unleashed. The joke stopped. The skepticism vanished. The so-called suicide box had teeth. And as names were painted on steel noses and more guns were bolted into place, everyone understood the truth. This weapon wasn't a gimmick, it was a hunter, and soon it would be pointed at something that could shoot back. The real test arrived with the Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyers, fast, disciplined, and arrogant, were still running troops and supplies down the slot, like nothing could touch them. These were not barges. A destroyer was 300 feet of hardened steel wrapped in flak guns and crewed by men who had spent months shooting airplanes out of the sky. To them, a medium bomber at low altitude was a gift. Big, slow, dead. Late in 1942, Japanese command assembled a major convoy to reinforce New Guinea. Fast transports, veteran escorts, confidence bordering on contempt. They believed speed would save them and altitude would protect them. They didn't know the rules had changed. At dawn, under low clouds hugging the water, the modified B-25s rolled down the runway heavy with fuel and artillery shells. Radios were quiet. Jokes were gone. Every crew knew what waited ahead. If the engineers had been right, one solid hit from a destroyer's main gun would turn their airplane into confetti. If Kenny had been right, they were about to hunt warships. When the clouds broke, the convoy appeared gray hulls cutting white wakes through dark water. The Japanese spotted them immediately. Black flak burst in the sky. Standard procedure followed: turn broadside, bring every gun to bear. But the bombers didn't climb. They didn't open bomb bays. They shoved the yokes forward and dropped down to 50 feet above the waves, props kicking up, spray engines screaming. From the bridge of the lead destroyer, the approach looked familiar. Low aircraft meant torpedoes. The captain ordered the ship to turn into the attack, narrowing the target. It was textbook defense. Then confusion set in. The American plane didn't release anything. It didn't pull up. It didn't dodge. It came straight on, nose down, charging head-on like it wanted to collide. Tracers reached out, cracking past the cockpit. The air filled with smoke and steel. Inside the B-25, the world collapsed to a ring sight and white knuckles on the controls. The pilot couldn't flinch. To aim the cannon, he had to hold steady. He was the guidance system. Machine guns opened first, a brutal curtain of fire that swept the bow and bridge, smashing glass and forcing gunners down. The flak faltered. That was the opening. At close range, dangerously close, the loader tapped the pilot's shoulder. The shell was live. The pilot made a final micro-adjustment and squeezed the trigger. The airplane slammed back against its own momentum. Smoke filled the cockpit. And then the shell hit, punching through steel, detonating deep inside the ship. The destroyer lurched, wounded and burning. For the first time in the Pacific, a warship had been cracked open by an airplane firing artillery. And everyone in the sky knew there was no going back now. The first hit didn't kill the destroyer, but it broke the spell. Smoke poured from the bow, black and angry, and the ship's perfect white wake faltered. Whatever the shell had found inside boiler steam line, electrical trunk, it had bitten deep. The predator was bleeding. And in war, that's all it takes. The B-25 screamed overhead so low, the rear gunner could see sailors scattering on the deck below. As the pilot hauled the aircraft into a hard turn, gravity doubled inside the fuselage. This was the most dangerous moment. The cannon loader fought the G-force's boots slipping on the vibrating metal floor as he dragged another 15-pound shell from the rack. Muscles burned. Vision narrowed. He slammed the round into the breech, locked it, and screamed into the intercom. The gun was ready again. The pilot rolled back toward the target. The destroyer wasn't maneuvering anymore. It was limping, listing slightly fire-licking from twisted steel. Anti-aircraft fire resumed, but it was wild now. Fear had replaced discipline. The hunters had become something else in the sailors' minds. This wasn't an airplane anymore. It was a charging animal. The second run was deliberate. The pilot aimed for the stern where speed lived. Once again, machine guns raked the deck, pinning crews behind shields. Once again, the cannon fired. The recoil shook the airframe like a fist. The shell struck near the depth charge racks, and the world detonated. A secondary explosion tore the aft section open in a rolling fireball. Debris arced into the air. The water itself rippled outward in a dark, expanding ring. When the smoke cleared, the destroyer's wake was gone. The screws had stopped. The ship lay crippled, dead in the water. That was the signal. The rest of the squadron dropped in, switching weapons. Bombs skipped across the sea like flat stones, slamming into the hull and detonating against steel. The destroyer groaned as plates buckled and water rushed in. A warship that had ruled these waters for a year was beaten to death in minutes, not by a battleship, not by a submarine, but by modified bombers flying at wave-top height. As the B-25s pulled away, radio. Chatter erupted, shouts, laughter, disbelief. Adrenaline spilled out with the words. But beneath it was something heavier, a realization settling in. The equation of naval warfare had just been shattered. Speed was no longer enough. Flak was no longer a shield. If an airplane could carry a tank gun and survive long enough to use it, then the ocean had become a killing ground. And the Japanese Navy had just learned that lesson the hard way. When the B-25s turned for home, they didn't look like victors. They looked battered, scorched, barely held together. Soot streaked the steel noses. Paint blistered from muzzle blasts. Inside the cockpits, hot brass casings rolled across the floor, with every bank chiming like broken glass. Hands shook. Ears rang. Flight suits were soaked through with sweat. These weren't men celebrating a clean win. They were men coming down from a near-death collision with reality. But the truth waited on the runway. As the wheels slammed onto the strip at Port Moresby and the engines wound down, something spread through the crews faster than any ordered disbelief turning into certainty. They hadn't just survived. They had changed the rules. In the debriefing room, the proof flickered to life. Grainy gun camera footage showed the impossible, an airplane firing artillery shells, striking steel explosions blooming from inside a destroyer's hull. There was no arguing with it, no theory left to debate. The ship hadn't been damaged, it had been killed. General Kenny watched in silence. Then he smiled, the tight, satisfied smile of a man who had gambled his career, his pilots and the war itself, on an idea everyone else had called insane. He ordered the photos rushed stateside. He wanted every engineer who had warned him about torn wings and stalled engines to see the truth burned into film. The airplane had held, the physics had bent, and the Japanese Navy had paid the price. What followed was immediate and irreversible. Factories stopped hesitating and started building. The B-25G went into production, followed by even heavier armed versions. Armor was added, guns multiplied. The Mitchell stopped pretending to be aerodynamic and embraced what it had become, a street fighter of the sky. Out on the water, the effect was just as dramatic. Japanese captains no longer steamed confidently in daylight. Convoys hugged coastlines, hid in weather, ran at night. The Tokyo Express, the symbol of untouchable speed, had lost its nerve. The hunters were being hunted now. The age of the invincible surface ship was cracking. And it wasn't cracking under elegant theory or perfect math. It was breaking under brute force, low altitude, and the sound of a cannon firing from an airplane that was never supposed to exist. The cannon's reign was violent and brief. As 1943 bled into 1944, the war accelerated and technology began to catch up with desperation. The 75mm gun had saved the campaign when nothing else worked, but it demanded perfection. Pilots needed nerves of steel. Loaders needed brute strength. One missed run meant circling back through flak. It was raw human unforgiving. Then came the rockets. High-velocity aircraft rockets, lighter, cleaner, easier. A pilot could loose a full salvo with a single squeeze, no recoil hammering the airframe. No man wrestling shells inches from an explosion. Firepower multiplied, risk dropped. The brutal elegance of the cannon gave way to efficiency. Later B-25s lost the big gun, replacing it with solid noses packed with machine guns, flying buzzsaws that shredded targets by volume instead of a single killing blow. The crews missed the monster. They missed the moment when the plane seemed to stop in midair, when you felt the shot in your bones. But wars don't reward nostalgia. They reward what works. The cannon had done its job. It bridged a gap between failure and dominance long enough for the next generation of weapons to arrive. When the war ended, the gunships faded quietly. Cannons were unbolted. Airframes scrapped or sold. Pilots went home and folded those days into silence. The story shrank into a footnote, an insane improvisation from a desperate time. But ideas don't die that easily. They wait. 20 years later, in another jungle war, the concept returned. Old transport planes circled targets, pouring fire from the sky. Then came the ultimate descendant, a massive gunship carrying cannons and howitzers, orbiting like a predator, raining precision destruction below. Every shot echoed the same defiance of physics, first proven over the Pacific. The engineers had said it couldn't be done. The manuals had called it suicide. But history isn't written by caution. It's written by people who look at impossible problems and choose violence, ingenuity, and nerve. Once a general threw a rule book away. Once a pilot aimed an airplane like a rifle. And once a bomber became a battleship long enough to change a war. The story should have ended there, with scrap metal surplus guns and forgotten airframes. Most people assume that's how war innovations die. Used once, filed away, replaced by something cleaner, smarter, more modern. But this idea refused to stay buried, because what the B-25 gunships proved wasn't just that a cannon could fly. They proved something far more dangerous, that air power didn't need elegance to dominate. It needed persistence. The bomber with a tank gun had shattered a rule everyone thought was permanent. And once a rule is broken, it never truly comes back. Years later, new wars dragged old lessons out of dusty archives. In Southeast Asia, American forces faced a familiar problem. Enemies hidden in jungle moving at night, immune to fast jets screaming overhead. Precision alone wasn't enough. Speed wasn't enough. What was needed was presence, pressure, a weapon that could stay and keep firing. So the idea returned older, heavier, meaner. Transport planes were turned into orbiting killers. Guns mounted sideways. Crews circling targets for hours, pouring controlled destruction into the dark. The concept had matured, but its soul was unchanged. The lineage was unmistakable. Every shell fired was an echo of that first insane shot from a B-25 nose over the Pacific. Today's gunships carry weapons. General Kenny could only dream of cannons larger than his field gun, guided munitions sensors that see through night and weather. But strip away the technology and the philosophy remains brutally simple. Get close, hit hard, don't let go. The engineers once said the recoil would tear the wings off. They were wrong. The wings held. What broke instead was certainty, the belief that war must follow neat equations and perfect designs. The men who flew those early gunships proved that innovation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from corners, from desperation, from people willing to fly something that shouldn't exist because the alternative is losing. We tell this story because it almost vanished. Because the green dragons, the loaders choking on cordite, the pilots charging steel ships head-on, none of it fits the clean myth of technological progress. It was messy, dangerous, human. And because sometimes history isn't changed by the smartest solution on paper. Sometimes it's changed by the one bold enough to pull the trigger anyway. History likes clean lines, timelines, bullet points. But real change is loud, improvised, and usually smells like smoke. The flying artillery never fit neatly into doctrine, and that's exactly why it mattered. For a brief, violent moment, it solved a problem no one else could. It didn't win the war by itself, but it kept the war from being lost when the math said defeat was inevitable. The men who flew those missions didn't think of themselves as pioneers. They were just trying to survive the next run. Years later, many of them struggled to explain what it felt like to aim an entire airplane like a rifle to charge a steel warship head-on, knowing one lucky hit could erase them from the sky. There were no medals for inventing a new way to kill ships, just quiet memories locked away. As the decades passed, the story faded. Textbooks talked about carriers, submarines, rockets. The B-25 gunships became a footnote, an odd experiment from a desperate phase of the war. But footnotes matter. They're where the rules get broken. They're where future wars steal their best ideas. Every modern gunship owes a debt to that moment when someone ignored the manual and trusted nerve over numbers. When engineers said no and pilots said, "Watch me." When a bomber stopped being a delivery system and became a weapon in its own right. We tell this story because it reminds us that innovation isn't always clean. It doesn't always arrive with approval stamps and perfect equations. Sometimes it shows up welded together in a hot hangar, balanced with lead bars and flown by men who know it might kill them. The B-25 with a cannon wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, but it was honest. It met the enemy where they were and hit them with everything it had. And for a crucial stretch of the Pacific War, that was enough. If this story hit you, don't let it disappear again. Like the video, stay subscribed, and leave a comment, because history only survives if someone is still willing to tell it. And that's the part most people miss. This wasn't a story about a gun or even about an airplane. It was a story about a moment when the war demanded an answer, now not after another study, not after another revision. A moment when failure was bleeding men out of the jungle, and waiting was more dangerous than being wrong. The B-25 gunship existed in that narrow space between desperation and invention. It wasn't born from perfect theory. It was born from refusal, the refusal to accept that nothing could be done. The refusal to let equations decide the outcome while ships sailed freely and men died ashore. General Kenny didn't win because he was smarter than the engineers. He won because he was willing to be blamed, willing to risk ridicule, careers, and lives on an idea that looked insane on paper but made brutal sense in combat. And the crews who flew those planes weren't heroes because they were fearless. They were heroes because they climbed into cockpits knowing the plane might not forgive a single mistake and flew anyway. That mindset echoes far beyond World War II. Every time a rule is broken in warfare, every time doctrine lags behind reality, this story repeats itself in different shapes and different skies. Innovation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from corners, when the enemy has momentum, when options are gone, when someone decides that the old answers are no longer acceptable. The flying artillery didn't last forever. It didn't need to. Its job was to bridge a gap, to buy time to smash a door open so the next generation of weapons could walk through. And it did that job perfectly. So when we talk about World War II machines, we shouldn't just ask what they were designed to do. We should ask why they were pushed beyond their limits and who had the nerve to push them. Because history isn't shaped by flawless machines, it's shaped by flawed ones flown by stubborn people in moments when failure is no longer an option. And if there's one final truth this story leaves behind, it's this: wars don't turn on genius alone. They turn on nerve, on people willing to look at a machine, a rule book, a neat line of math, and decide none of it matters as much as stopping the enemy right now. The B-25 with a cannon wasn't elegant history. It was loud, violent, and temporary. It existed only because the moment demanded something reckless enough to work. And once that moment passed, it faded, just like so many tools forged in crisis. But fading doesn't mean failing. Some ideas aren't meant to last forever. They're meant to hit once hard enough to change the direction of the fight. For a brief window in the Pacific surface, ships stopped being untouchable. Speed stopped being safety. Flak stopped being confidence. Somewhere between the spray of the waves and the blast of a 75mm shell, the balance shifted. The ocean got smaller, deadlier, honest. The men who made that happen didn't think in terms of legacy. They were thinking about the next approach, the next reload, the next burst of tracer fire ripping past the cockpit glass. They were thinking about getting home. History came later, written quietly long after the cordite smell had faded from their clothes. That's why stories like this matter. Not because they celebrate destruction, but because they expose how fragile certainty really is. How often impossible is just another word for untested. How progress sometimes comes not from refinement, but from collision between desperation and imagination. The flying artillery was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to end an argument, and it did. It told the world that air power wasn't finished. Evolving, that dominance belonged not to the side with the cleanest theories, but to the one willing to adapt faster than fear. And once that lesson was learned, it didn't disappear. It sank deep into doctrine, into memory, into the next war waiting over the horizon. At 20,000 feet over Guadalcanal, a U.S. pilot is hunted by a Japanese Zero. His Wildcat shudders like a flying coffin. Cannon fire tears through the cockpit. He falls into shark-infested waters. This is the Pacific Air War. And weeks later, an overage farm boy will enter that sky and turn the hunters into prey. That sky had a reputation. Guadalcanal wasn't just another dot on the map. It was a grinder, a place where American pilots were fed into combat one by one and chewed apart. The men who flew there had a name: the Cactus Air Force. The press said it with pride. The pilots said it like a warning. They called their base Henderson Field, the graveyard. The enemy wasn't just the Japanese, it was the math of the air. American Wildcats were heavy, slow to respond, armored like trucks. The Japanese Zero was the opposite, light, agile, able to turn inside almost anything the U.S. could throw at it. For a year, it ruled the Pacific skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Veteran Japanese pilots knew it. They baited Americans into turns, waited for the Wildcat to bleed speed, then struck. Back in the States, the doctrine was simple: never turn with a Zero. Dive, shoot, run. On paper, it made sense. Over Guadalcanal and swirling, chaotic dogfights, it was getting men killed every single day. Survival wasn't victory, it was just delay. And yet, unknown to everyone in that burning sky, the solution was already on its way across the Pacific. Not a new aircraft, not a new order from Washington. Just a stubborn 27-year-old farm boy from South Dakota about to step into the deadliest airspace on Earth and fight the war the only way he knew how, like a hunter. Before he ever faced a Zero, before Guadalcanal burned his name into history, Joe Foss was fighting a different enemy: poverty, cold, time itself. He wasn't born into uniforms or academies. He was born in 1915 on a remote, unelectrified farm outside Sioux Falls, South Dakota. No paved roads, no safety nets. His childhood wasn't shaped by classrooms or textbooks. It was shaped by wind that cut through your coat dirt, that cracked under drought, and a sky that never cared how hard you worked. When the Great Depression hit, South Dakota collapsed. Crops failed, livestock died, money vanished. Survival wasn't a goal, it was a daily calculation. Joe Foss learned early that nothing was wasted, especially effort. If the family was going to eat, someone had to hunt. That's where the secret was born. As a boy, Foss hunted jackrabbits with an old shotgun, no scope, no luxury. His father gave him one rule: don't waste shells. A jackrabbit doesn't run straight. It zigzags, jukes, reverses. If you aimed at where it was, you'd miss every time. To hit it, you had to aim where it would be. Foss learned to calculate speed angle and timing in a heartbeat. He wasn't guessing. He was predicting. While other kids memorize formulas, Joe Foss was training his brain to solve moving problems at lethal speed. He wanted to fly. Badly. At 18, he saw Marine pilots roaring overhead at an air show and told his father, "That's what I'm going to do." But life intervened. His father was killed in a tragic accident. Joe dropped out of school to run the farm. The dream didn't die, it just went underground. For 6 years he worked by day and studied by night. He washed dishes to pay for flying lessons. He clawed his way toward the sky, one exhausted step at a time. Then Pearl Harbor was attacked. Joe Foss was 26. He ran to enlist as a fighter pilot and was rejected. Too old. Regulations said 25 was the cutoff. The experts told him his war would be teaching other young men how to fly, then watching them go die. They thought it was the end of the story. They didn't understand farmers. Because Joe Foss didn't quit. He looked for the flaw. And like he always had, he found it. Joe Foss didn't argue with the experts. He outmaneuvered them. If the Navy said he was too old to fight, he'd find another door. Foss joined the Marine Corps Reserve, slipping through a loophole the paperwork men hadn't closed yet. They made him an instructor. For 9 long months, he trained boys barely old enough to shave 20-year-olds who called him sir and trusted him with their lives. Then he watched them ship out to the Pacific. Many never came back. It ate at him. Foss wrote letters. He complained. He demanded combat duty again and again. He later said he became the loudest, most annoying instructor the Navy ever had. Eventually, just to shut him up, they relented. Advanced Fighter Training. A combat assignment. VMF 121. In October 1942, while Marion Carl was being blasted out of the sky, Joe Foss, 27 years old, already labeled too old, was loading onto a transport ship bound for Guadalcanal. Nothing prepared him for what he found. Henderson Field wasn't a base. It was a scar carved out of jungle. The air reeked of fuel rot and death. The runway was dirt and gravel chewed to pieces by constant bombing. The operations center was a wooden shack. The pilots lived in mud-floored tents. And everywhere were wrecks. Dozens of shattered aircraft shoved to the edges of the field, wings torn off, engines split open, cockpits stained dark. This wasn't storage. This was evidence. The men he met weren't fresh recruits. They were hollow-eyed veterans, skin yellowed by atabrine hands shaking from exhaustion and malaria. They didn't greet Foss like a reinforcement. They looked at him like replacement meat. Then he saw his plane, a Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Heavy, slow, rugged, but hopelessly outclassed by the Zero. Pilots called it a flying coffin. Foss ran his hand along the metal anyway. He'd driven trucks tougher than this back home. The briefing was short. The rule was absolute. Never turn with a Zero. Foss nodded. He understood the rule. But in his mind, he saw snow, wind, a jackrabbit cutting hard left. And he realized something none of the manuals ever had. Rules were written by men who had never hunted. Joe Foss's first flight over Guadalcanal wasn't a warm-up. It was a test, and the sky wasted no time administering it. He climbed to altitude in his Wildcat, the engine vibrating through the seat, the horizon an endless blue. The veterans had warned him. They come out of the sun. You never see them until it's already too late. Foss scanned the sky, feeling blind, exposed. This wasn't the open prairie. There was nowhere to hide. Then the radio crackled. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Foss looked up and his stomach tightened. Zeros, diving fast, too fast. Their wings flashed silver as they fell out of the sun like knives. Instinct screamed at him to turn to fight, but the rule echoed louder. Never turn with a zero. He shoved the stick forward and dove. The wildcat picked up speed, howling, as the jungle rushed up to meet him. Tracers streaked past his canopy. 1-0 stayed glued to his tail, patient, confident. Foss kept diving until the treetops blurred, then pulled out hard and ran for home. He landed alive, but he wasn't satisfied. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from fury. The doctrine had worked. He survived. But nothing else changed. The zeros were still there. Tomorrow they'd be back. Running wasn't winning. It was waiting to die later. Days later, the sky gave him another chance. Japanese bombers appeared over the island, escorted by zeros. The fight exploded instantly. Wildcats and zeros twisting, diving, crossing at lethal speed. Foss saw a zero lining up behind one of his wingmen, closing in for the kill. The rule said, dive away, save yourself. The farmer said otherwise. Foss rolled hard and didn't aim at the zero. He aimed at nothing, empty sky, far ahead of it. He pulled the trigger and held it down. A long, steady burst. It looked wrong, wasteful. The Japanese pilot never saw it coming. Locked onto his target, committed to the turn, the zero flew straight into the stream of .50 caliber fire. The wing tore off. The aircraft vanished in a flash of flame and debris. Silence filled Foss's cockpit. He hadn't outturned the zero. He hadn't outrun it. He had outthought it. When he landed, the ghosts of Henderson Field gathered around him. Foss looked at his battered Wildcat and grinned. "This thing's a truck," he said, "but it's a tough truck, and it shoots straight." The hunt had begun. In a place like Henderson Field, nothing stayed secret for long. By nightfall, every pilot on the island had heard what Joe Foss had done. A Wildcat had turned with a zero and survived. Men who had spent weeks watching friends die leaned in as Foss explained it, tracing invisible arcs through the air with his finger. "Don't chase them. Don't aim at the airplane. Aim at the space it's about to steal. Lead it until it feels wrong. Then lead it more." They were desperate enough to listen. Foss was soon given a small flight of Wildcats, 8 planes in total. They weren't the best. They were the leftovers. New arrivals, replacements, men who hadn't lasted long enough to become ghosts yet. No one expected miracles from them, not even command. When reporters saw this mismatched group following the tall farm boy into combat, they gave them a name: Foss's Flying Circus. On October 16th, the circus went to work. 8 Wildcats climbed into a sky already crowded with enemy aircraft. 32 Japanese planes were inbound, zeros among them. 4-to-1 odds. On paper, it was suicide. Foss didn't hesitate. He paired his pilots off, ordering them into a tight weave, each man guarding the other's blind spot. If a zero attacked one, it would expose itself to the other. The formation wasn't elegant, but it was deadly. Foss led the dive. He spotted a zero, calculated its path, and fired before instinct said he should. The enemy aircraft flew straight into the stream of .50 caliber rounds and disintegrated. Almost instantly, another zero dropped onto Foss's tail, but his wingman was already there, rolling over and cutting it down. The fight became a rhythm. Attack, cover, lead, fire. Wildcats protecting Wildcats. Zeros dying in mid-turn. 10 minutes later, it was over. 5 Japanese aircraft were gone. All 8 American planes came home. For the first time, the graveyard was winning. The kill board filled faster than anyone believed possible. October 18th, 2 more. October 20th, another. By October 20th, Joe Foss was officially an ace. 5 victories in 10 days. The 2-old farmer from South Dakota had become the most dangerous man in the sky over Guadalcanal. And success, like smoke, never stays invisible for long. Japanese pilots began hearing one name repeated in radio intercepts: Foss. The wildcat that didn't run, the American who fired at empty sky and somehow made it lethal. What had once been sport for veteran Zero pilots was becoming something else entirely. They weren't hunting wildcats anymore. They were hunting Joe Foss. When the enemy learns your name, the war changes. By late October, the Japanese weren't just fighting wildcats anymore. They were hunting Foss. Veteran Zero pilots were reassigned. Tactics shifted. Traps were set. Guadalcanal's sky, already deadly, became personal. On November 7th, it nearly ended. Foss was leading his flight when the attack came out of nowhere, an elite group of Japanese aces, diving hard, fast, and coordinated. The sky exploded into chaos. Tracers stitched the air. Engines screamed. Foss fought on instinct, now the farmer's math running faster than thought. He lined up 2 zeros and cut them down in quick succession. Then he felt the UDAR. Cannon fire ripped into his wildcat from behind. The engine detonated. Smoke filled the cockpit. Controls went slack. The plane was dying. Foss didn't panic. He rode it down until the last second, then bailed out, tumbling into the jungle as his wildcat slammed into the trees below. He hit the ground hard, but alive, shaken, bruised, breathing. They pulled him out before nightfall. Any other pilot would have been done. 2 days later, Foss was back in the air. This time he was chasing a Japanese float plane over open water. Focus narrowed. The kill was almost his. He never saw the rear gunner. The burst came fast. The engine shattered. For the second time in 3 days, Foss's plane was dead. But now there was no jungle beneath him, only ocean. He ditched hard. The wildcat sank in under 30 seconds. Foss surfaced alone 10 miles from land, drifting in one of the most shark-infested waters on Earth. The Pacific was quiet, too quiet. Then he saw the fins. They circled, bumped him, tested him. Foss treaded water for hours, muscles burning, heart hammering. He had no weapon, no radio, just patience. The same patience he'd learned waiting in frozen fields for game to move. 4 hours later, salvation appeared, a canoe. Native islanders sent by an Australian coast watcher who had spotted the crash, beat the water with their paddles, and scared the sharks off. They dragged Foss aboard hypothermic and barely conscious. Back at Henderson Field, the doctors grounded him immediately. Malaria, exposure, exhaustion. The flying circus would fly without him. The Japanese heard the rumors soon after. Joe Foss was dead. For the first time in weeks, the sky over Guadalcanal felt quieter. But ghosts don't stay buried for long. For a while, Joe Foss's trick seemed unstoppable. Zeros kept dying, wildcats kept coming home. And the sky over Guadalcanal slowly began to feel predictable. That's when it almost killed him. Late one afternoon, Foss dove on a lone Zero that looked careless, too high, too slow, too exposed. It was the kind of setup he had punished dozens of times before. Foss calculated the lead, aimed at empty sky, and fired. Nothing happened. The Zero didn't turn where it was supposed to. It didn't commit. Instead, it snapped into a brutal vertical maneuver Foss hadn't seen before. In a split second, the roles reversed. Tracers ripped past Foss's canopy. His Wildcat shuddered as rounds punched through the wings. For the first time since arriving on Guadalcanal, Joe Foss realized something terrifying. The enemy was learning. The Japanese pilot wasn't baiting a turn. He was baiting the lead. He had watched Wildcats fire into empty space before. He had seen friends die that way. And now he was countering it, forcing Foss to commit early, then changing the fight at the last possible moment. Foss broke hard, barely escaping with his life. He limped back to Henderson Field, his plane torn up his hands, shaking not from fear, but from clarity. The trick wasn't magic. It was timing, and timing could be beaten. That night, Foss didn't sleep. He sat alone, replaying the fight over and over. The farmer's eye adjusted again. If the enemy was learning to fake the future, Foss would stop relying on patterns. He would hunt the pilot, not the plane. Read intent, read hesitation, read fear. By morning, the trick had evolved. And when Joe Foss took off again, he wasn't just ahead of the Zero. He was ahead of the man flying it. Joe Foss didn't die in the ocean, but Guadalcanal tried again anyway. For 2 weeks, he lay in a hospital bed, shaking with fever, his body soaked in sweat one moment and racked with chills the next. Malaria clawed at him from the inside. Doctors told him the truth. If he went back up, it could kill him. His flying circus was still fighting. Zeros were still coming. And Foss was trapped on the ground, staring at a ceiling, while the hunt went on without him. The Japanese believed the rumors. The Wildcat that wouldn't run was gone. The farmer who fired at empty sky was finished. Confidence crept back into their cockpits. They were wrong. Joe Foss recovered the only way he knew how, by refusing not to. He dragged himself out of bed before the doctors cleared him. Lost weight, yellow skin, hollow eyes. He barely looked like the man who had terrorized the skies weeks earlier. But when he climbed into a new Wildcat, something familiar came back online. The fever blurred his vision. The farm sharpened his instincts. On November 30th, Foss went hunting again. The first Zero never saw him. Foss fired a short, precise burst, and the Japanese fighter fell away in flames. The radio crackled. Pilots who thought they were fighting ghosts now realized the ghost was real and angry. The Japanese threw everything they had at him. Elite pilots, coordinated attacks, ambushes. Foss kept flying through it all, his body failing while his mind stayed lethal. By January 1943, his score stood at 23. He was 3 kills away from a number every American pilot knew by heart. 26. The record set in World War I by Eddie Rickenbacker. Untouchable, sacred. A mountain no one had climbed in over 20 years. Joe Foss was 27 years old, flying with malaria, in a plane everyone said was inferior. And he was climbing that mountain anyway. Every landing crew saw the same thing. A Wildcat punch full of holes, Foss shaking uncontrollably from fever as they lifted him out of the cockpit. He was fighting 2 wars now, one in the sky, one in his blood. And somehow, he was winning both. The sky over Guadalcanal was about to witness the breaking of a legend. And Joe Foss would do it the only way he ever had, by ignoring the rules and trusting the hunt. January 15, 1943, began with an order Joe Foss had no intention of obeying. He was burning with fever, weaker than he had ever been, his body shaking from malaria. The doctors grounded him on the spot. Foss listened, nodded, and waited until they were gone. When word came in that a massive Japanese convoy, the Tokyo Express, was racing toward Guadalcanal under heavy fighter cover, he knew where he belonged. He dragged himself to the flight line and climbed into his Wildcat. By the time he reached altitude, the sky was already alive. It was the largest air battle Foss had ever seen. Zeros everywhere. Wildcats twisting through smoke fire and tracer rounds. There were no clean formations, no room for hesitation. Foss's vision blurred. His head pounded, but his hands moved on instinct. He wasn't thinking about tactics or doctrine anymore. He was hunting. He saw a Zero lining up behind a wingman and rolled without hesitation. Foss didn't aim at the aircraft. He aimed at the future empty sky ahead of it and fired. The Japanese pilot committed to the turn and flew straight into the burst. The Zero came apart in midair. That was kill number 24. Seconds later, another Zero dove in confident, trying to bleed the Wildcat into a losing turn. Foss refused the bait. He climbed high, rolled over the top, and dropped out of the blind spot. One short controlled burst. The engine detonated. The aircraft spiraled down. Kill number 25. Eddie Rickenbacker's legendary record was now tied. Foss didn't stop. Through the chaos, he spotted a Japanese float fighter trying to escape, clawing upward in a desperate climb. This was the final test, the veteran pilot versus the farmer's eye. Foss calculated speed, angle, and intent in a heartbeat and fired a long deflection shot into open sky. A second later, the rounds met the cockpit. The aircraft folded and vanished into the Pacific. Kill number 26. When Foss landed at Henderson Field, the entire base was waiting. The graveyard had become a place of victory. Men lifted the fever-racked farm boy from his cockpit and carried him on their shoulders. In a single afternoon, flying an inferior aircraft while half delirious with malaria, Joe Foss had shattered the myth of the Zero. The sky over Guadalcanal would never be the same again. While Henderson Field erupted in celebration, the mood hundreds of miles away could not have been more different. In Japanese ready rooms and carrier briefing huts, the story spreading through intercepted radio chatter sounded impossible. Veteran pilots returned from missions, pale and shaken, struggling to explain what they had seen. Wildcats weren't supposed to fight like this. They weren't supposed to win. For months, the Zero had been king. Light, agile, untouchable. Japanese doctrine was built on certainty, force the American plane into a turn, slide onto its tail, finish the kill. It had worked everywhere. China, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines. Guadalcanal was supposed to be no different. Then Joe Foss happened. Pilots began reporting the same strange phenomenon. They would dive on a Wildcat, expecting it to flee. It wouldn't. They would bait it into a turn, confident they had the advantage. Instead, the American plane would do something that made no sense, rolling, early climbing, oddly firing at empty sky. And then a heartbeat later, a Zero nearby would simply explode. It felt unnatural, like fighting an enemy who knew the future. The Zero hadn't suddenly become weak. The pilots hadn't suddenly become careless. What had broken was confidence, the belief that the outcome was predetermined. Foss had done what the Japanese high command feared most. He had proven that their greatest weapon was not invincible. The sky over Guadalcanal changed after that. Zeros no longer dove with reckless certainty. Attacks became cautious. Pilots hesitated. And hesitation in air combat is fatal. The Cactus Air Force felt it immediately. The hunted had become the hunters. Joe Foss didn't just rack up kills. He rewired the psychology of the air war. His deflection shooting his refusal to chase his willingness to let the enemy commit first. These weren't tricks. They were lessons. Pilots copied him. Squadrons adapted. What began as a farmer's instinct became a new American way of fighting. For the first time in the Pacific, Japanese pilots were afraid. They weren't afraid of the Wildcat. They were afraid of the man flying it. And that fear spread faster than any aircraft ever could. Victory didn't end the war for Joe Foss. It ended his body. Days after breaking the record, the adrenaline faded and what was left nearly killed him. The malaria he had been fighting in the air finally took control on the ground. The fevers returned harder, longer, relentless. Foss could barely stand. He had lost over 30 pounds. His skin turned sallow. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The same man who had faced Zeros and sharks without flinching was now being eaten alive from the inside. This time, there was no argument. The doctors grounded him for good. Joe Foss didn't leave Guadalcanal as a conquering hero. There was no parade, no cheers, no final flight. He was evacuated on a stretcher carried past the same runway where wrecked Wildcats still lay, half buried in the dirt. The graveyard he had helped turn into a victory ground claimed its price anyway. Foss was flown from island to island, hospital to hospital, his body broken by the place he had helped save. Back in the United States, the nation finally caught up to what had happened in that distant patch of jungle and sky. Newspapers printed his name. Radios told his story. He was hailed as America's ace of aces. But behind the headlines was a man relearning how to walk without collapsing, how to sleep without shaking, how to live without the ski. On May 18, 1943, Joe Foss stood in the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, praising his dauntless courage and extraordinary skill. Cameras flashed. History froze the moment. But Foss knew the truth. The medal wasn't for genius or bravery alone. It was for endurance, for refusing to quit when logic said stop, for fighting long past the point where his body had anything left to give. Guadalcanal had taken its pound of flesh. Joe Foss paid it willingly. And in doing so, he changed the course of the war in the Pacific forever. Joe Foss never went back to Guadalcanal. His war in the sky was over, but the war he had changed was just beginning to turn. What Foss left behind wasn't just a kill count. It was a way of thinking. Across the Pacific, pilots studied what he had done and realized the truth: the Zero hadn't been defeated by better metal, but by better judgment. Deflection shooting became standard. The THAC weave spread through squadrons like wildfire. Wildcats and later Hellcats and Corsairs stopped running. They started hunting. Guadalcanal had been the proof. The rest of the Pacific would be the consequence. For Japan, the damage ran deeper than aircraft losses. Foss had shattered certainty. Veteran pilots who once flew with swagger now climbed into their cockpits, cautious, second-guessing every move. The myth of invincibility was gone. And once a myth dies, it never comes back the same. The air war shifted, momentum followed. For Foss himself, fame was unavoidable, but it never defined him. He didn't stay in uniform, chasing glory. When the war ended, he went home to South Dakota, back to open land, back to the people who understood work without applause. He used his name not to elevate himself, but to serve. He entered public life, was elected to the state legislature, and in time became governor of South Dakota. Later, he helped build the American Football League from the ground up. Different arenas, same instinct. See the flaw, fix it, move forward. Through it all, Foss never spoke like a legend. He spoke like a farmer. He credited luck. He credited the men around him. He credited habits learned long before Guadalcanal, when missing a shot meant an empty plate at dinner. Joe Foss died in 2003 at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors, remembered as America's ace of aces. But his true legacy wasn't the number 26. It was the lesson he left behind. Wars aren't won by manuals alone. They're won by people willing to see differently. James McKenna saw a fatal flaw in a cable and fixed it with piano wire. Simo Häyhä rejected doctrine and trusted iron sights. And Joe Foss, the farm boy who was told he was too old, looked at the deadliest sky on earth and decided to fight it like a hunt. Sometimes that's all it takes to change history. History loves machines. Names of planes, numbers of guns, charts, manuals, specifications. But wars are never truly decided by steel alone. They turn on moments when someone looks at the rulebook, sees the flaw, and refuses to obey it. Joe Foss was one of those men. He wasn't supposed to matter. Too old, wrong aircraft, wrong doctrine, dropped into the deadliest airspace on Earth with a plane everyone agreed was inferior. But Foss didn't fight the zero the way the experts said he should. He fought it the way he had hunted his entire life, by watching, waiting, predicting. By aiming not at what was, but at what had to be. That was his modification. Not metal, not wiring. A mindset forged on frozen fields in South Dakota. And he wasn't alone. Across the war, victory often came from men like him. James McKenna, the mechanic who ignored specifications and fixed a lethal flaw with 6 inches of piano wire. Simo Häyhä, the farmer who rejected modern optics and turned iron sights into terror. They weren't reckless. They were precise. They understood something deeper than doctrine, the cost of being wrong. Joe Foss paid that cost in fever and blood, in years taken from his body. Guadalcanal broke him physically. But before it did, he broke the myth of the zero. He gave American pilots something more powerful than a new aircraft. He gave them belief. Belief that the enemy could be beaten. Belief that skill and judgment could overcome technology. Belief that even in a flying coffin, a man who understood the hunt could change the course of a war. That is why these stories matter. Not because they glorify combat, but because they honor the individuals who carried it. Men who endured fear, pain, and exhaustion not for medals, but because quitting was never an option. Joe Foss went home. He lived his life. He served his country again in peace. But for 44 days over Guadalcanal, he rewrote the rules of air combat and proved that sometimes history turns not on orders from above, but on the quiet confidence of a man who knows exactly where to aim. And that is how wars are truly won. When the guns finally fell silent, Joe Foss didn't chase immortality. He didn't live in the past or cling to the sky that had nearly killed him. Like most men who truly understand war, he stepped away from it. He went home, back to South Dakota, back to wide horizons and honest work. The same land that had taught him patience, prediction, and grit welcomed him back without ceremony. Foss carried fame, but he never wore it loudly. To him, heroism wasn't something you talked about. It was something you survived. America, however, hadn't forgotten. He was invited to speak to inspire, to represent a generation that had endured the impossible. Foss accepted the responsibility not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder of cost. He entered public service, serving in the South Dakota legislature then as governor. Later, he helped build the American Football League, another fight against entrenched systems, another arena where he saw flaws and pushed forward anyway. Different battlefield, same man. Joe Foss lived a long life, but Guadalcanal never truly left him. Malaria's shadow lingered. The weight of 44 days in the deadliest sky on Earth never fully lifted. Yet he never complained. He had seen what complaining solved: nothing. When he died in 2003 at the age of 87, he was buried with full military honors. Flags folded, rifles fired, a final salute to America's ace of aces. But numbers fade, titles blur. What remains is simpler and rarer. Joe Foss proved that wars are not won by perfect machines or flawless doctrines. They are won by people willing to think differently when thinking differently is dangerous. People who trust hard-earned instinct over printed rules. People shaped by hardship long before combat ever found them. He was told he was too old, too slow, flying the wrong airplane, in the wrong sky. And yet when it mattered most, Joe Foss saw the future of the fight before anyone else did and aimed there. That is how legends are made, quietly.
March 3rd, 1943. The Bismarck Sea is calm at dawn. Admiral Kimura believes his convoy is untouchable. Then shapes skim the waves. American B-25s. Guns roar. Steel burns. In just 15 minutes, an entire division vanishes. The sun was just climbing over the horizon when the Bismarck Sea revealed itself wide, calm, almost gentle. Thin clouds drifted across a pale sky, and the water reflected gold and blue like a mirror untouched by war. On the bridge of the destroyer, Shirayuki Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching his convoy cut clean white wakes through the sea. 8 destroyers, 8 transport ships, nearly 7,000 soldiers packed below deck. Everything was in perfect order. For more than a year, these waters had belonged to Japan. Convoys sailed under a shield of disciplined steel and experience. American bombers had come before high-flying B-17s that missed slow torpedo planes that died in fire. Nothing had ever broken the pattern. Doctrine worked. Training worked. Confidence followed. Below the decks, young soldiers from Osaka, Kyoto, Sapporo laughed softly, wrote letters home, and sipped tea as the ships rolled gently beneath them. This was just a crossing. The real fight waited on land. No alarms sounded. No sirens screamed. The sea felt safe. At 600 hours, Kimura raised his binoculars and studied the horizon. No enemy contacts. Good visibility. On schedule. What he could not see was that history was already moving toward him, low, fast, and deadly, about to tear apart everything he believed the sea would allow. Far to the south, while Kimura's convoy cut its steady path through the Bismarck Sea, the rules of naval warfare were already dying. In the choking heat of an Australian airfield beneath rattling tin roofs and clouds of red dust, American crews worked in silence. This wasn't a factory. It was a place where desperation replaced permission, and where failure meant more men dying on distant beaches. At the center of it all stood Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. He was not a polished strategist or a desk-bound planner. He was a mechanic who flew a pilot who fixed his own machines, and a man who had seen too many bombers return empty while convoys sailed on untouched. High-altitude bombing didn't work. Torpedoes failed. And every missed ship meant another American grave in New Guinea. Gunn refused to accept that. So he broke the bomber. He rolled a B-25 Mitchell into a hangar and began tearing it apart by hand. The glass nose came off. The Norden bomb site, once sacred, was ripped out and tossed aside. Anything that didn't make the airplane deadlier was stripped away. Steel plates were welded into the nose. Then came the guns. 2.50 caliber, then 4, then 6. Finally, 8 long barrels jutted forward like the fangs of a machine built to kill at close range. The mechanics hesitated. There were no manuals, no orders, only Gunn's certainty. He recalculated the balance himself, shifted fuel, added counterweights. When the modified B-25 lifted off for its first test, the airframe trembled under the weight of steel and ammunition. At low altitude, Gunn squeezed the trigger. The sky didn't crack. It screamed. Shell casings poured from the fuselage like rain. The recoil hammered through the aircraft as if it were alive. When Gunn landed, he was smiling. "She doesn't bomb anymore," he said quietly. "She eats ships." Word spread fast. What had begun as a gamble in a dusty hangar was about to meet its first real targets. And far to the north, Admiral Kimura had no idea that the sea he trusted was about to rise up and betray him. What Gunn had created was only half the weapon. Guns could shred steel, but ships were still hard to kill. To finish them, the Americans needed a way to put bombs inside a moving hull. That answer came from another quiet officer who was tired of watching failure from 10,000 feet. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group had seen enough missed runs to know the truth. The Pacific was too wide, the weather too violent, Japanese captains too skilled. High-altitude bombing against ships wasn't courage, it was futility. So Ben looked down, not up. He watched waves break against reefs. He watched children skip stones across water. And one thought refused to let go. What if the bomb didn't fall? What if it skipped? At Port Moresby, he gathered his crews and explained the idea. Fly straight, fly level, fly so low the sea fills the windshield. Release the bomb at the last second and let it bounce across the surface once, maybe twice, then smash into the ship at the waterline. The room went silent. Everyone understood the risk. One burst of anti-aircraft fire at that height could tear a bomber apart. Release too early and the bomb skips away. Too late, and it ricochets back into the aircraft. They tested it anyway. Day after day, B-25s roared in over a wrecked cargo ship trapped on a reef. Propellers threw spray into the air. Bombs skipped wild, exploded short, or missed entirely. Aircraft were lost. Crews were shaken. But slowly, something clicked. Pilots learned the rhythm, the speed, the moment when sea and machine aligned. At the right height, the right angle, the bomb behaved like it wanted to kill ships. When one finally struck true, skipping once before slamming into the rusted hull and detonating inside the explosion, lifted the wreck out of the water. Watching from shore, commanders understood immediately. Guns' strafers would silence the guns. Ben's bombs would finish the job. Two reckless ideas had just fused into a single deadly doctrine. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a Japanese convoy sailed on unaware that the ocean itself had been turned into a weapon. By late February 1943, The pieces were finally in place. Guns, strafers, and Ben's skip bombers were no longer experiments. They were weapons. At airstrips carved from jungle and mud, crews trained until exhaustion blurred the horizon. They flew at mast height, 50 feet above the sea, so low their reflections raced beneath the fuselage. One mistake meant death. Precision was the only protection they had. The plan was brutally simple. The strafers would go in first, fast, low, and screaming, unleashing 8.50 caliber guns to rip open bridges, shred anti-aircraft crews, and blind captains at the helm. Seconds later, the bombers would follow, releasing their bombs so close the ships would have no time to react. The entire attack would be over in less than a minute. No warning. No recovery. Pilots practiced attacking from the sun, from the wind, from angles that radar couldn't see and gunners couldn't track. Mechanics painted shark mouths and names on aluminum noses, ruthless, dirty Dora Hell's Angel, not for bravado but to remind themselves these machines were hunters now. At night, men slept beside their aircraft, afraid to miss the call. Then the call came. Intelligence confirmed a Japanese convoy was moving toward Leh. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, thousands of troops. To Tokyo, it was routine. To the men at Port Moresby and Eagle Farm, it was the moment everything had been built for. Maps were spread across briefing tables. Grease pencils traced approach routes over the Bismarck Sea. Armorers loaded belts of ammunition and set delay fuses by hand. In the early hours of March 3rd, engines coughed to life in the darkness. Rain misted the runway. Harnesses were tightened. Someone whispered a prayer. One by one, the B-25s lifted into the night navigation lights, blinking as they disappeared over the jungle. Far to the north, Admiral Kimura's convoy sailed on beneath a rising sun, unaware that the aircraft hunting them were no longer bombers at all, but something new, fast and unforgiving, already racing low across the sea. At 10 a.m., the first warning came exactly as Admiral Kimura expected. Lookouts spotted silver flashes high above the horizon, American B-17Ss glinting in the sun. Kimura lowered his binoculars, calm, almost relieved. This was familiar. High-altitude bombers. Predictable. Harmless. He ordered the convoy to maintain course. Anti-aircraft crews swung their guns skyward, loaders feeding belts as black bursts of flak bloomed above the ships. The sea thundered with disciplined fire. Every eye looked up. No one looked down. 15 miles away, skimming the waves at nearly 300 miles an hour, a different kind of aircraft was coming in. 12 B-25's noses packed with guns' propellers whipping mist off the surface. They flew so low, their shadows raced across the water. Sunlight flashed on aluminum fuselages as they rose just enough to clear the swells, then dropped again, invisible to radar, unstoppable to human reflex. Major Ed Larner led the charge. Through his windshield, he could already see the Japanese convoy, perfect formation, white wakes slicing the sea. He watched the flak burst uselessly far above and smiled grimly. The trap had worked. A shout went up on the destroyer Shirayuki. Aircraft low guns tried to swing down crews, scrambling in panic. Too late. Larner pressed the trigger. The nose of his B-25 exploded in flame. 8.50 caliber machine guns roared as one, a solid wall of fire tearing forward at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Bridges shattered. Steel buckled. Men vanished in sparks and smoke. Anti-aircraft crews died before they could fire a single round. The sound wasn't gunfire anymore. It was a mechanical scream, a force of nature ripping across the deck. Bombs followed, skipping across the sea like stones slamming into hulls below the waterline before detonating deep inside. Ships lurched. Fire erupted. Smoke clawed into the sky. Behind Larner, more B-25s surged, in each picking a target, each delivering the same brutal lesson. In seconds, the convoy's perfect order collapsed into chaos. And Admiral Kimura, standing on a deck suddenly alive with fire, realized the truth too late. The sea he trusted had just turned against him. The attack did not slow. It multiplied. As Larner's B-25 clawed past, the burning Shirayuki, 11 more strafers poured in behind him, each one diving into the smoke and fire like a predator picking its kill. The convoy dissolved in seconds. Destroyers swerved violently, throwing up white walls of water as captains tried desperately to shield the transports. It only made them easier to hit. One after another, the B-25s came in low and fast. Guns walked lines of fire from bow to stern, cutting bridges apart, shredding rangefinders, ripping gunners from their mounts before they could even turn their weapons. Men ran. Men burned. Commands were never shouted. There was no one left alive to give them. Then the skip bombers followed. Bombs slapped the surface of the sea, bounced once, twice, and smashed into steel hulls at the waterline. The explosions came from inside the ships. Transports split open like torn cans. Engine rooms vanished in fire. Ammunition cooked off in violent bursts that lifted entire decks into the air. The destroyer Arashio tried to interpose itself between the attackers and the transports, turning bravely into the storm. 3 strafers hit it at once. 24 machine guns raked the bridge in a single converging stream. When the smoke cleared, the bridge was gone. Seconds later, the crippled ship slammed into a transport beside it, both vessels locking together in flames. The air above the convoy became a furnace. Tracer fire stitched the sky. Oil spread across the sea and ignited, turning blue water black and burning. Sailors jumped overboard only to surface screaming as the water itself caught fire around them. From above, American gunners watched in stunned silence. Ships were exploding everywhere. Smoke columns climbed thousands of feet into the sky. What had been a disciplined formation minutes earlier was now a spinning mass of wreckage fire and men fighting the impossible. The entire battle lasted less than 15 minutes. When the last B-25s pulled away, the guns finally falling silent, the Bismarck Sea was unrecognizable. The convoy was gone, reduced to sinking hulls, floating debris, and a silence broken only by flames and distant cries. For Admiral Kimura, standing amid the destruction, one truth was now undeniable. The old rules of war were dead. When the last American aircraft vanished over the southern horizon, the Bismarck Sea fell into a silence more terrifying than the gunfire. Burning oil crackled across the surface. Wreckage drifted aimlessly. Where a perfectly ordered convoy had sailed minutes earlier, there was now only fire smoke and men in the water. Admiral Kimura stood amid the devastation, surrounded by heat and ash, struggling to comprehend what had happened. 15 minutes. That was all it had taken. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were either sinking or already gone. Thousands of soldiers, men who had been singing and writing letters at dawn, were now trapped below decks or thrashing in a sea that burned them alive. Survivors leapt from ships only to surface in flames. Others clung to floating debris, their uniforms soaked in oil, their voices hoarse from screaming. Some were dragged under by the suction of sinking hulls. Others vanished as secondary explosions ripped through ammunition holds. The sea itself seemed to rise and fall with each detonation, flipping lifeboats and bodies alike. Rescue attempts were desperate and chaotic. Damaged destroyers threw ropes and nets over their sides, pulling aboard the wounded with hands slick from blood and fuel. There were no bandages, no morphine. Sailors tore their own shirts into strips, as the injured lay moaning on steel decks that were still hot from fire. Then the attackers returned. Low-flying strafers swept back across the wreckage, guns flashing again, not at ships, but at anything that still moved. Lifeboats shattered. Men in the water dove beneath the surface, choosing drowning over bullets and fire. For those who survived the first wave, hope died with the sound of the engines returning. By midday, sharks had begun to circle. Drawn by blood and vibration, they moved through oil-slicked water as survivors watched in helpless terror. Screams were cut short. One by one, voices disappeared. By nightfall, the convoy was gone. Of the nearly 7,000 soldiers who had left port, fewer than 1,200 would ever see land again. The rest were claimed by steel fire and sea. And as darkness settled over the Bismarck Sea, it became clear that this was not just a defeat, it was a warning. War had changed, and nothing that sailed in daylight would ever be safe again. When the first radio reports reached Rabaul, disbelief spread faster than panic. Officers read the message twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the meaning. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers lost, thousands dead. The convoy erased in a single daylight attack. Nothing like it had ever happened to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Not at night. Not by submarines. Not like this. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. In Tokyo, the report reached the highest levels of command. The language was blunt. No heroic phrasing. No tactical excuses. The truth was unavoidable. The sea lanes were no longer theirs. The doctrine that had protected Japan's empire for 2 years, speed formation, the umbrella of steel, had failed catastrophically. What shattered it was not a new battleship or a larger fleet, but aircraft flying so low they turned the ocean itself into a weapon. Emergency meetings were called. Maps were unrolled. Red circles spread across the South Pacific, marking the growing reach of Allied air power. Every major convoy route now lay within range of B-25 strafers. The conclusion came quickly and mercilessly. Moving supplies by day was suicide. The order went out across the fleet: no more daylight convoys. Troop transports were abandoned. Large formations were scrapped overnight. Instead, supplies would move in darkness: small ships, barges, submarines slipping along coastlines under moonless skies. It was a desperate improvisation, later known as the night run. It kept some units alive, but it could never replace what had been lost. An empire built on movement had been forced to crawl. The consequences rippled outward. Japanese garrisons in New Guinea and the Solomons began to starve. Ammunition ran short. Medicine disappeared. Malaria and hunger killed more men than enemy bullets. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea was not just the loss of ships, it was the death of logistics, the collapse of mobility, the moment momentum slipped away for good. For the Americans, the victory was quiet. No parades, no headlines at home. But among pilots and mechanics, the lesson was clear. Innovation had won. Improvisation had broken tradition. A handful of men in dusty hangars had changed the rules of naval warfare forever. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield of fleets and formations. It had become a hunting ground. And after the Bismarck Sea, the hunters ruled the daylight. In the months that followed, the shock of the Bismarck Sea never faded, it spread. Every Japanese sailor who stepped onto a transport afterward carried the memory of what had happened in daylight. Crews whispered about it below decks. Officers avoided speaking its name aloud. The sea had betrayed them, and everyone knew it could do so again without warning. Convoys that once sailed proudly beneath the sun now crept through darkness. Lights were blacked out. Radios stayed silent. Ships hugged coastlines like criminals preying clouds, and night would hide them from the sky. Even then, fear traveled faster than fuel. At the first rumor of aircraft engines, men froze. Some swore they could hear the guns before they saw the planes, a deep, rolling roar that meant death was already seconds away. Reports from survivors painted the same picture again and again. The attackers appeared without warning. Too low, too fast, too close. Gunfire like machinery tearing itself apart. Ships exploding from the inside. Officers admitted their men broke at the sight of low-flying bombers' courage drowned by memory. Sailors began calling the B-25 the eight-eyed demon, convinced it could see them even in darkness. Inside Japanese headquarters, analysts searched desperately for answers. Charts and doctrines were rewritten, but the conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. The enemy did not fight as expected. He adapted faster than tradition could respond. Discipline and bravery were no longer enough. The battlefield had become industrial, improvisational, unforgiving. For the Americans, the lesson hardened into doctrine. The B-25 strafer was no longer an experiment. It was a solution. Production increased. Tactics spread. Other squadrons learned to fly lower strike faster and vanish before defenses could react. The skies over the Pacific became a place of sudden violence, where control belonged not to fleets, but to whoever could think and move first. The balance of the war shifted quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of strategy maps. Japan still fought, still resisted. But something essential had been lost, the freedom to move, to supply, to breathe. From that point on, every mile of ocean was hostile. Every voyage was a gamble against innovation. The Bismarck Sea had not just destroyed a convoy, it had exposed a future where adaptation ruled, and hesitation meant extinction. And in that future, the sound of engines low over the water became the last warning many would ever hear. Years later, long after the fires on the Bismarck Sea had gone cold, the meaning of that day became impossible to ignore. What happened in those 15 minutes did not stay buried with the wrecks. It rewrote the war. Japanese planners no longer asked how to win battles. They asked where the Americans were not. Large surface movements vanished. Fleets hid by day and moved like ghosts by night. An empire that once ruled the Pacific now survived by avoiding it. The Americans drew the opposite lesson. Speed mattered more than size. Ideas mattered more than tradition. The strafer became a symbol not of brute force, but of thinking faster than the enemy. Factories adopted field modifications. New variants carried even more forward firepower. Pilots stopped talking about bombing runs and started talking about hunts. Airfields, harbors, convoys, nothing was safe if it could be reached low and fast. The sound became legend. Japanese sailors said it first as a warning, then as a curse, the roar of guns that didn't chatter but screamed. To hear it meant you were already too late. To see the aircraft meant you were already dead. Courage didn't vanish, but it was drowned by memory. No drill could prepare men for an enemy that arrived inside their reaction time. Across the Pacific, attacks multiplied. New Guinea, New Britain, the Solomons. The pattern repeated with brutal efficiency, sudden appearance, blinding fire ships breaking apart from within. Logistics collapsed under the weight of constant interruption. Hunger and disease finished what bombs began. The war did not end in one place, it bled out everywhere. Historians would later argue over weapons and numbers, but the veterans knew the truth. The decisive blow wasn't steel or caliber. It was adaptation. A handful of men in a dusty hangar had proven that invention itself could be a weapon, and that once unleashed, it could not be put back. When the wrecks finally settled beneath coral and silt, the sea grew quiet again. Sunlight returned. Fish swam through rusted corridors where men once stood screaming. Above the surface, the Pacific looked unchanged. But beneath it lay the moment war became something colder, faster, and relentless. The Bismarck Sea was not just a battle. It was the moment the future arrived, low over the water, guns blazing, and impossible to stop. The legacy of the Bismarck Sea did not end when the smoke cleared. It traveled forward in time, carried by the idea that an aircraft could be more than a delivery system, it could become the weapon. What began as desperation in a sweltering hangar became doctrine, then inheritance. In the years that followed, American engineers and pilots kept asking the same dangerous question: what if we push it further? The answer echoed through later wars. Transport planes returned to the battlefield not as lifelines, but as executioners. Side-firing guns turned slow aircraft into floating fortresses. Fire no longer fell from above, and it swept sideways, precise and merciless, pinning enemies to the earth with mechanical certainty. The strafer's DNA lived on in every gunship that stalked the night. But among the men who had flown the first B-25s, there was no triumph in the memory. They remembered the sea on fire, the ships breaking apart, men leaping into water that burned them alive. Major Ed Larner would later stand in museums staring at polished aircraft hanging silent from ceilings and say nothing for a long time. The planes no longer screamed, but he still heard them. On the other side of the ocean, the lesson cut just as deep. Japanese naval cadets studied the battle not as a failure of courage, but of imagination. Tradition had not saved them. Discipline had not saved them. The enemy had learned faster. And in modern war, speed of thought mattered more than honor or numbers. Today, the Bismarck Sea is calm again. Coral grows over twisted steel. Fish drift through passageways where soldiers once waited for orders that never came. Above, the waves roll gently, giving no sign of what lies beneath. But the wrecks are still there. So is the lesson. Innovation wins wars, but it always leaves ghosts. The Strafer proved that necessity could turn mechanics into architects of history. It also proved something darker, that once invention is unleashed, it does not choose sides. It only accelerates destruction. And on March 3, 1943, in 15 minutes of fire and noise, the world crossed a line it would never step back from. Long after the war ended, when uniforms were folded away and the Pacific returned to blue silence, the truth of the Bismarck Sea refused to fade. Veterans from both sides spoke of it with the same uneasy pause, not as a victory, not as a defeat, but as a moment when war itself changed shape. The B-25 Strafer had begun as an act of survival. No grand strategy, no blueprint. Just men working faster than death welding steel and loading guns because waiting meant losing. Yet that urgency revealed something deeper. In modern war, invention was no longer support, it was the front line. Whoever adapted first would decide who lived long enough to adapt again. That lesson echoed forward. New aircraft were built around the same idea: durability over elegance, firepower over tradition. Planes designed not to intimidate, but to endure, to stay low, to stay close, to finish the fight face to face. The philosophy born over the Bismarck Sea resurfaced again and again, each time deadlier, each time more refined. But progress carried a shadow. For every engineer who admired the brilliance, there were survivors who remembered the cost. The sound of guns that never paused. The sight of ships opening like torn flesh. The sea burning. Innovation had shortened wars, but it had also deepened the abyss they fell into. Speed left no room for mercy. Precision left no room for escape. Major Pappy Gunn never lived to see how far his idea traveled. When he died years later, a note was found among his papers. It read simply, "We built them fast because men were dying faster. There was no pride in it, only necessity." Today, the wrecks still rest beneath the Bismarck Sea, pierced with neat circular holes where bullets once passed. Coral softens the steel. Fish move through shadows of corridors and gun mounts. From above, the water looks peaceful. It always does. But beneath the surface lies the moment humanity learned something it could never forget, that creativity can be as lethal as any weapon, and once unleashed, it changes everything. The sea keeps its secrets. History remembers the sound. Standing on the shores of Papua New Guinea today, it's almost impossible to imagine what happened here. The Bismarck Sea looks endless and calm, its surface broken only by wind and light. No smoke, no fire, no sound of engines tearing the air apart. And yet beneath those gentle waves lies a frozen moment, steel hulls, split open corridors, punched through by bullets, and the remains of men who never saw land again. Divers who later found the wrecks were stunned by what time could not erase. The ships were not torn apart by massive explosions alone. Their hulls were drilled through with hundreds of clean circular holes, each one the unmistakable mark of a .50 caliber round. Even decades underwater, the evidence was undeniable. This was not destruction from above. It was execution at point-blank range. For the Americans, the battle became legend. Proof that imagination could overpower doctrine. That a handful of mechanics and pilots working in a dusty hangar with no permission but necessity could alter the course of a global war. The B-25 Strafer was no longer just an aircraft. It was a philosophy: adapt fast, strike hard, leave nothing time to react. For Japan, the memory carried a different weight. The Bismarck Sea entered naval education as a warning written in blood. Tradition without adaptation was a liability. Courage without flexibility was not enough. The sea they once ruled had become a prison watched by an enemy that learned faster than they could think. War moved on. New weapons replaced old ones. New battlefields claimed new lives. But the lesson endured. Progress in war is never neutral. Every breakthrough shortens the distance between decision and death. Today, coral grows where fire once burned. Fish drift through gun mounts and passageways. Above it all, the sea gives nothing away. But history remembers. The Bismarck Sea was not just where ships were lost. It was where the future of warfare revealed itself, low, fast, merciless. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The men who built the Strafer never set out to change history. They were not chasing glory or legacy. They were racing a clock measured in lives. Every convoy that slipped through meant another beach soaked in blood, another jungle filled with graves. So they worked faster than doctrine, faster than permission, faster than the war itself. And for a brief, violent moment, they won that race. But victory carried a weight that never lifted. Pilots who survived the Bismarck Sea rarely spoke about it in detail. When they did, their voices slowed. They remembered the way ships seemed to open up under fire, the way the sea burned, the way the noise followed them home long after the engines shut down. One veteran said the worst part wasn't the attack. It was the silence afterward, when the guns stopped, and there was nothing left to shoot, only men in the water. For Japan, the lesson cut even deeper. The Imperial Navy did not lose because its sailors lacked courage. They lost because the world had changed faster than their beliefs. The Bismarck Sea proved that tradition, no matter how disciplined, could be outpaced by invention. From that day forward, Japanese strategy became defensive, cautious, haunted by the memory of aircraft that arrived inside the margin of human reaction. The strafer itself became both symbol and warning. In museums, it hangs clean and silent, its aluminum skin polished, its guns inert. Visitors admire its lines, its ingenuity. But those who know its story hear something else, the echo of 8 machine guns firing as one, the sound that meant there was no time left. War did not end with the Bismarck Sea. It only accelerated. Factories turned ideas into weapons. Weapons turned minutes into massacres. The distance between thought and destruction grew shorter with every innovation. What began in a dusty hangar became a template for modern war: adapt or disappear. Today, the ocean above the wrecks is calm. Sunlight ripples across the surface. The past feels far away. But beneath the waves, steel still lies where it fell, and history waits quietly unchanged. The battle did not just destroy ships, it revealed a truth the world has lived with ever since. In war, invention is unstoppable, and once unleashed, it never asks who must pay. On the morning of March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea kept its secret. It looked the same as it always had, calm blue, indifferent. By nightfall, it had become a graveyard, and beneath its surface something far more lasting than wreckage had settled. The battle proved that war no longer belonged to the biggest fleet or the strongest armor. It belonged to whoever learned fastest, whoever dared to break their own rules first. In 15 minutes, tradition drowned, and a new age surfaced, one where machines were reshaped in the field. Tactics rewritten mid-war, and survival depended on imagination as much as courage. The B-25 strafer was never meant to be elegant. It was brutal, improvised, and unforgiving, just like the war that created it. 8 gun barrels pointing forward, no hesitation, no warning. It did not ask permission from doctrine. It erased it. For the men who sailed that morning, the sea became the enemy. For the men who flew low over the waves, it became a weapon. And for the world watching afterward, the message was unmistakable: modern war would be decided not by tradition, but by adaptation. Today, the Bismarck Sea is quiet again. Coral grows over steel. Sunlight dances where fire once burned. But history has not moved on. It waits beneath the waves, reminding us that progress in war is never clean, and innovation always leaves a shadow. What happened here was not just a battle. It was the moment the future arrived, flying low, thinking fast, and impossible to stop.
August 1943. High over the Pacific, an American fighter pilot is seconds from death. A Japanese Zero is locked onto his tail, every escape option exhausted. Then, in a moment of pure desperation, he does the unthinkable. He flips his aircraft upside down and dives straight toward the ocean. That split-second decision doesn't just save his life. It shatters the Zero's dominance and changes for air combat forever. This is the story of Richard Bong and the maneuver no one was ever supposed to survive. At 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Richard Bong was running out of time. His P-38 Lightning shook violently as 20-millimeter cannon shells ripped into the left engine. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. Oil pressure was dropping fast. Airspeed was bleeding away. Below him, the Pacific stretched out endlessly, cold, empty, and unforgiving. His wingman was already gone, spiraling down toward the ocean in a trail of black smoke. Bong was alone now. Behind him, a Japanese Zero sat perfectly on his tail, less than 200 yards back. Gun steady, angle perfect. The killing shot was only seconds away. Bong had been trained at the best fighter schools in America. He knew every defensive move in the book barrel rolls, scissors split, S chandelle. In the last minute and a half, he had tried them all. And every single time the Zero pilot matched him with ease. The Zero wasn't just following him, it was hunting him. Bong's altitude kept dropping as he fought to keep the nose up. Gravity and damage were winning. In maybe 10 more seconds, it would be over. Another pilot lost. Another number added to the brutal math of air combat in the Pacific. Then, with no options left and death staring him straight in the face, Bong did something every instructor had warned would kill him instantly. He rolled the P-38 completely upside down and shoved the stick forward. The Lightning flipped inverted and plunged toward the ocean in a screaming vertical dive. Blood rushed to Bong's head. His vision turned red. Loose gear floated up and slammed into the canopy. The engines howled in protest as the aircraft tore through the air under violent negative G-forces. No manual said it could survive. For 2 terrifying seconds, Bong was flying blind. When he finally rolled the aircraft upright at 12,000 feet, having dropped 6,000 feet in moments, the Zero was gone. Not damaged, not falling, just gone. Richard Bong circled cautiously, scanning the sky in every direction. He expected the Zero to reappear at any second, climbing back up for another attack. But there was nothing. No silhouette, no engine noise, no enemy. The Japanese fighter that had been seconds from killing him had simply vanished. Bong was gasping for air, his head pounding, his eyes burning from the violent rush of blood caused by the negative G-forces. At the time, he had no idea what had just happened or why it had worked. All he knew was that he was alive. What Bong didn't realize in that moment was that he had just stumbled onto a maneuver that would change the air war in the Pacific. Not through careful planning, not through new technology, but through pure desperation. Within months, what began as one terrified pilot's instinctive forbidden move would spread across American airfields from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. Fighter pilots began whispering about it in tents over drinks before missions. If a Zero gets on your tail, don't turn, don't climb, roll inverted, and dive. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand how completely the Japanese Zero dominated the skies in 1942 and early 1943. When American pilots first encountered the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, they were stunned. The aircraft seemed to defy everything U.S. intelligence believed about enemy fighters. It could turn tighter, climb faster, and fly farther than anything the Americans had. In early battles over the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots were achieving kill ratios that felt unreal. For every 3 Japanese aircraft shot down, the Allies were losing 9, sometimes more. The Zero was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, it weighed barely 3,700 pounds empty, over a ton lighter than many American fighters. That weight savings came at a cost. The aircraft had no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its airframe was built to minimum stress limits. But in a turning fight, none of that seemed to matter. At combat speed, a Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn in under 16 seconds. An American P-40 needed more than 23. In air combat, 7 seconds might as well be forever. Every time an American pilot tried to turn with a zero, the result was the same. The Japanese fighter would simply come around faster and slide onto the Americans' tail guns lined up for an easy kill. And American pilots kept dying because they were fighting the zero on its terms. By 1942, American pilots were dying not because they lacked courage, but because they were using the wrong playbook. U.S. fighter tactics were still rooted in World War I doctrine. Pilots were taught to turn hard, tighten the circle, and outmaneuver the enemy until they could line up a shot. That approach worked in Europe, where German fighters were heavier and less agile. But in the Pacific against the zero, it was a death sentence. Every time an American pilot tried to turn with a zero, the outcome was almost guaranteed. The Japanese fighter would simply outturn him, slide onto his tail, and end the fight in seconds. One man saw the problem clearly. Lieutenant Commander John Thack, one of the U.S. Navy's most thoughtful tacticians, watched his pilots struggle and die, even in training exercises against captured zeros. He became obsessed with understanding why. Thack studied the zero carefully. He acknowledged its strengths: unmatched maneuverability, rapid climb, tight turns. But he also noticed something critical. The Zero's performance came from extreme lightness, and that lightness came with serious weaknesses. American fighters like the P-38, Lightning II, P-47 Thunderbolt, and the F-4U Corsair were heavier, faster, and far more rugged. They couldn't outturn the Zero, but they didn't need to. They could dive faster. They could absorb more damage. And their engines kept running under conditions that would cripple a Zero. Thack's solution became known as the Thack Weave, a defensive maneuver where two fighters flew in coordinated patterns, covering each other's tails. When a Zero attacked one aircraft, it would expose itself to the guns of the other. The weave worked. It saved lives. But it had limits. It required perfect coordination. It was defensive by nature. And while it helped pilots survive, it didn't give them a reliable way to defeat the Zero outright. What American pilots still lacked was an offensive answer, something that could flip the fight completely. That answer wouldn't come from a briefing room or a training manual. It would come from another moment of desperation high above the Pacific, when a lone pilot decided not to turn, but to do something no one was supposed to survive. The moment that turned an accident into a deliberate tactic came on April 7, 1943, over the Russell Islands in the Solomon Chain. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron was flying a P-38 Lightning when his flight was jumped by 8 Japanese Zeros attacking from above. In the chaos of the initial merge, Lynch became separated from his wingman. Suddenly, he was alone at 20,000 feet with multiple enemy fighters trying to get onto his tail. Lynch was no rookie. He was a pre-war pilot flying combat missions almost daily since Pearl Harbor. He knew exactly how these fights usually ended. If he tried to turn, he would die. If he tried to climb, he would die. Even running away in level flight wouldn't work. The Zeros would catch him before he could build enough speed. He needed to break contact immediately. But every standard escape maneuver required turning. So Lynch made a decision that went against everything he had been taught. He rolled his P-38 completely upside down and pushed the stick forward. The world flipped. The ocean rushed up toward the canopy. Blood surged into his head as the aircraft plunged into a violent inverted vertical dive. His vision began to redden under the crushing negative G-forces. And then, something incredible happened. The Zeros couldn't follow. When the Japanese pilots tried to roll inverted and dive after him, their aircraft began to shudder. Their lightweight airframes strained under forces they were never designed to handle. Worse, their engines started to sputter as fuel flow broke down under negative G. Some of the Zero engines quit entirely. Lynch's P-38, heavier, faster, and built to survive punishment, screamed downward with increasing speed. At 12,000 feet, he rolled upright and pulled back hard, converting that speed into altitude. In seconds, the fight had completely reversed. Now the Zeros were below him, slower, scattered, confused. Lynch dove back down from above. His .50 caliber machine guns converged on a Zero that never saw him coming. It disintegrated under the burst. He destroyed another moments later. When Lynch landed, his face was covered in tiny red dots, burst blood vessels caused by the negative G-forces. His eyes were bloodshot. His head throbbed with pain that would last for days. But he was alive. And more importantly, he knew something now. That night, sitting with other pilots, Lynch told them exactly what had happened. Flying inverted wasn't suicide. The Zero physically couldn't follow. The maneuver wasn't just an escape, it was a trap. What had started as a desperate survival move was now a weapon. And word like that spreads fast among fighter pilots. What Lynch had discovered wasn't magic. It was physics. In normal flight, gravity pulls a pilot downward at 1G. When a fighter dives by pulling back on the stick, the aircraft generates positive G-forces, pressing the pilot deeper into the seat. Fighter pilots trained constantly to handle this tightening muscles, controlling breathing, staying conscious under 6, 7, even 8 Gs. But an inverted dive was different. When a pilot rolled upside down and pushed the stick forward, the aircraft entered negative G. Instead of being pushed into the seat, the pilot was pulled upward. Blood rushed toward the head. Vision darkened or turned red as blood flooded the eyes. Even 2 or 3 negative Gs could be unbearable. It was painful, disorienting, and dangerous. But for a few seconds, a trained pilot could survive it. Aircraft engines, however, could not. Japanese Zeros used carburetors designed for positive G flight, where fuel flowed downward from tanks mounted above the engine. When the aircraft went inverted and negative G hit, gravity pulled fuel away from the carburetor intake. The result was immediate. Engines sputtered, power dropped, and in many cases, the engine simply quit. The Zero didn't stall because of pilot skill. It stalled because fuel stopped reaching the engine. American fighters had a critical advantage. Aircraft like the P-38 used fuel injection, which delivered fuel under pressure instead of relying on gravity. That meant the engines kept running upright, inverted climbing, or diving. So when an American pilot rolled upside down and dove, his aircraft accelerated. When a Zero tried to follow, its engine betrayed it. This was the heart of the breakthrough. The inverted dive didn't just help pilots escape. It forced the Zero to give up the chase, leaving it slow, vulnerable, and often helpless, while the American fighter built massive speed. That speed could then be converted into altitude, and altitude meant control. What had once been a desperate survival move was now a repeatable formula escape. Speed, altitude, attack. It was brutal. It was effective. And it completely rewrote the rules of air combat in the Pacific. The tactic didn't spread through manuals or official orders. It spread the way fighter pilot knowledge always had, through word of mouth. Veterans talked, rookies listened, and the message was always the same. If a zero gets on your tail, don't turn. Roll inverted and dive. At first, the maneuver had different names. Some called it the inverted escape. Others referred to it as a negative G dive. In formal reports, it was sometimes described as a variation of the split S. But among pilots, the language was simpler. Go upside down on them. Despite warnings in training manuals about the dangers of inverted flight, pilots kept using it because it worked. Across the Pacific, American fighter squadrons began incorporating the tactic into real combat. Pilots flying the P-38 Lightning used it most effectively, but it didn't stop there. The P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy and powerful, could dive even faster. The F-4U Corsair, with its massive engine, turned the maneuver into a screaming vertical plunge that no Zero could survive following. Kill ratios began to change. Where American pilots had once been outmatched 3-to-1, the numbers started swinging the other direction. For every U.S. fighter lost, Japanese losses climbed 3, 4, sometimes 5 aircraft destroyed. The Zero, once feared for its agility, now had a fatal weakness that could be exploited again and again. American pilots learned to bait Zero pilots into tail chases. They would deliberately let a Japanese fighter close in just enough to commit. Then the American would roll inverted and dive away. The Zero pilot trained to press the attack would follow and lose engine power speed or control. In seconds, the fight flipped. The American aircraft would pull out of the dive, convert speed into altitude, and come back down from above with every advantage. The Zero pilot rarely saw the attack coming. What made the tactic even more effective was its psychological impact. Japanese pilots had been trained to believe that once they were on an enemy's tail, the fight was over. Now, time after time, American fighters simply vanished beneath them, only to reappear moments later from above. Confidence eroded. Hesitation crept in. By late 1943, the Zero was no longer an unstoppable predator. It was becoming a liability, fragile, vulnerable, and dangerously predictable against pilots who understood energy, speed, and physics. The air war over the Pacific had entered a new phase. And for the first time since the war began, American pilots weren't just surviving, they were winning. The inverted dive didn't just change tactics, it changed psychology. Air combat isn't only about speed and firepower. It's about confidence, about believing you control the fight. In early 1943, that confidence belonged almost entirely to Japanese Zero pilots. They knew that if they got behind an American fighter, the outcome was almost certain. By late 1943, that certainty was gone. Zero pilots began to hesitate. Chasing an American aircraft now carried real risk. Any pursuit could suddenly turn into a trap, an American fighter vanishing in a screaming dive, only to return moments later from above with overwhelming speed and position. One of Japan's most experienced aces, Saburo Sakai, later wrote about his confusion the first time he encountered the maneuver. He described lining up perfectly behind a P-38, expecting an easy kill, only to watch the American flip upside down and disappear beneath him. When Sakai tried to follow, his engine sputtered and lost power. He was forced to break off the attack, helpless, while his opponent escaped. Moments later, the American was back diving from above. The hunter had become the hunted. Japanese training doctrine had no answer for this. Zero pilots were taught to win through turning combat, to exploit agility and climb. Nothing prepared them for enemies who refused to turn at all, who fought purely with speed, altitude, and energy. At the same time, Japan was facing another crisis. Its most experienced pilots, the men who had dominated the skies in 1941 and 1942, were being lost at a catastrophic rate. Combat attrition in the Solomons. New Guinea and the Philippines wiped out veteran squadrons. Their replacements arrived with minimal flight hours and almost no combat experience. These young pilots were being thrown into the air against Americans who had survived dozens, sometimes hundreds of missions, and who now understood exactly how to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. The gap widened rapidly. American pilots grew more aggressive, more confident. They dictated when to fight and when to disengage. Japanese pilots, once fearless, became cautious, sometimes overly so. By 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific skies had fully shifted. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air superiority, was no longer feared. It was outmatched not by better dogfighting, but by better thinking. And the psychological edge, once firmly in Japanese hands, now belonged to the Americans. The impact of the inverted dive didn't end with World War II. After the war, American tacticians studied what had worked in the Pacific. The lessons were clear. Speed mattered, energy mattered, and trying to outturn a more maneuverable enemy was often the fastest way to die. The maneuver that began as a desperate improvisation was formalized into doctrine. The split S, a refined version of the inverted dive, became standard training for fighter pilots. Variations of the same principle were used in Korea against MiG-15s and again in Vietnam against agile Soviet-built fighters. In 1969, when the U.S. Navy founded its elite fighter weapons school, Top Gun, the core philosophy echoed the same lesson learned over the Solomon Islands decades earlier: fight on your terms, not your enemies. Use speed, use altitude, use physics. The legacy of that moment in 1943 lived on in every pilot trained to think in terms of energy instead of ego. For Richard Bong, the man whose split-second decision helped unlock that truth, the war ended in victory. He became America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed kills. Other pilots studied his gun camera footage in awe, watching him calmly roll inverted dive away from danger, then return from above to finish the fight. He survived the Pacific War, but he did not survive the peace. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, Richard Bong was killed testing a new P-80 jet fighter in California. He was just 24 years old. Today, restored P-38, lightning fly at air shows, occasionally performing the split S maneuver that once meant the difference between life and death. Japanese Zeros sit quietly in museums, beautiful, elegant, and fragile, no longer symbols of terror, but reminders of how quickly dominance can vanish. The Zero didn't change. American aircraft didn't change. What changed was understanding. The inverted dive was not a new weapon. It was not a secret design. It was the realization that the laws of physics could be more powerful than raw maneuverability, and that survival sometimes depends on breaking every rule you've been taught. History often turns not on grand plans or perfect machines, but on moments of desperation when someone is willing to try the impossible and lives long enough to prove it works. In August 1943, one pilot rolled his aircraft upside down and refused to die. And in doing so, he helped turn the tide of the Pacific Air War forever. The inverted dive may have been born in the piston-engine skies of World War II, but its lessons are still very much alive today. Modern fighter aircraft no longer rely on carburetors. Jet engines don't quit when pushed into negative-G fly-by-wire systems. Advanced fuel management and reinforced airframes allow pilots to maneuver in ways Richard Bong could never have imagined. But the principle behind the maneuver hasn't changed. Modern air combat is still governed by energy management, speed, altitude, and positioning. Today's pilots flying aircraft like the F-16, F/A-18, or F-35 are trained not to outturn the enemy, but to control the geometry of the fight. They learn when to disengage, when to dive away, and when to trade altitude for speed, exactly the logic behind the inverted dive. Even beyond aviation, the same idea applies. Modern military vehicles, tanks, drones, naval vessels, missile systems are no longer judged only by raw performance. Sensors, networking, and tactics matter just as much as armor or firepower. The most advanced system can still be defeated if it's forced to fight in a way it wasn't designed for. That's the real legacy of the inverted dive. Not a specific maneuver, not a piece of hardware, but the mindset. Every modern military doctrine emphasizes exploiting asymmetries, finding what the opponent can't do, not what they do best. That thinking drives electronic warfare, cyber operations, drone swarms, and even space-based defense systems. The Zero was once unbeatable because everyone fought it head-on. It stopped being unbeatable the moment someone refused to do that. In today's world, technology evolves faster than ever. But dominance is still temporary. Every system has limits. Every advantage creates a vulnerability. The pilots of 1943 didn't win because they had better machines. They won because they understood how to use their machines more intelligently than their enemy. That lesson remains as relevant now as it was over the Solomon Islands. Because no matter how advanced the equipment becomes, victory still belongs to those who understand the rules of the fight and are willing to break them when necessary. In war, training is supposed to save lives, but sometimes it does the opposite. At the start of the Pacific War, both sides entered combat with confidence in their doctrines. Japanese pilots trusted the Zero's unmatched maneuverability, and the turning fight philosophy drilled into them from day one. American pilots trusted the lessons passed down from World War I: tight turns, closing circles, dogfighting skill. Both were wrong. Japanese doctrine taught pilots that once they were on an enemy's tail, the fight was over. There was no need to consider escape, disengagement, or energy management. The Zero would win because it always had. That belief worked until it didn't. American doctrine failed in a different way. It assumed every fight could be won by flying better inside the turn. Against the Zero, that assumption killed pilots faster than enemy bullets. What changed the war wasn't a new aircraft or a rewritten manual. It was the willingness of individual pilots to ignore what they had been taught when reality proved it wrong. When Richard Bong rolled his aircraft upside down, he wasn't following doctrine. He was violating it. When other pilots followed, they weren't being reckless. They were adapting faster than the system around them. The Japanese system couldn't do that. As losses mounted, Japan doubled down on the same ideas. New pilots were rushed through shortened training pipelines and taught the same turning tactics, even as American pilots were actively exploiting those weaknesses. There was no time, no structure, and no cultural space to question the fundamentals. Training became rigid. Doctrine became dogma. And dogma got people killed. The Americans made mistakes too, but they changed faster. They listened to survivors. They allowed unofficial knowledge to spread. They let experience override instruction manuals. In doing so, they turned failure into advantage. That may be the most uncomfortable lesson of the entire Pacific Air War. The most dangerous thing on a battlefield is not inferior equipment. It's unquestioned belief. History is full of forces that lost, not because they were weaker, but because they were too confident in what they already knew. The Zero didn't fail because it was a bad aircraft. It failed because its strengths locked its pilots into a way of fighting they could no longer escape. At 11:40 p.m., the sky over Muro was pitch black. No moon, no stars, just radar blips and 12 Japanese bombers closing in. Below 20,000 American troops slept unaware that one man nearly out of fuel would decide who lived until morning. Below those sleeping tents, the war had a heartbeat, and it was counting down. Major Carroll C. Smith sat hunched inside the Black Widow's cockpit, surrounded by darkness so complete it felt solid. He was 26 years old, 43 combat missions behind him, 4 enemy aircraft already burned into the ocean. Tonight, none of that mattered. What mattered was the radar screen glowing behind his right shoulder. 12 contacts, 12 Japanese bombers, all inbound. For 2 straight weeks, the enemy had come every night. Sometimes bombers, sometimes suicide aircraft, testing the thin American defenses at Muro. 334 air raid alerts in 14 days. The engineers below were racing to finish 2 airfields that would decide the coming invasion of Lingayen Gulf. The Japanese understood that if those runways survived, the invasion would be unstoppable. Smith's squadron had arrived just 3 days earlier. They were exhausted, unfamiliar with the field, and painfully few in number. And right now, only 1 aircraft was airborne. 1 pilot, 1 radar operator, 1 airplane. If even a handful of bombers slipped through, men would die in their sleep. Construction would stop. The invasion clock would stall. Smith felt the pressure settle. In his chest, not fear, but responsibility. He tightened his grip on the throttles as the intercom crackled to life. Contact moving south, the radar operator said calmly. Multiple returns. Smith exhaled once. Then he pushed the Black Widow forward into the dark. Smith already knew the numbers, and they terrified him. 1 P-61 Black Widow, 12 incoming bombers, less than 3 hours of fuel. Night fighting wasn't about heroics. It was about math. Cold, merciless math. Each interception took time. Time to climb, time to vector time, to close, time to fire. 10 minutes per target if everything went right. 10 minutes while the other bombers kept flying. Even if Smith shot down 3 or 4, the rest would still reach Muro. And 1 bomber was all it took. Fuel dumps, ammunition stacks, engineers sleeping in canvas tents. A single explosion could turn the airfields into a graveyard and delay the invasion by weeks. Weeks meant more landings under fire, more dead Americans on the beaches of Lingayen Gulf. Smith had trained for this moment for 18 months. radar intercepts in total darkness, gunnery without a horizon, flying by instruments while your instincts screamed that you were falling. Night combat was unforgiving. There were no second chances, only sudden silence. Behind him, Lieutenant Philip Porter watched the radar scope like a surgeon monitors a heartbeat. Green blips slid across the screen, each one an aircraft the enemy believed was invisible. Porter's voice stayed calm, professional. It had to be. Panic would kill them faster than flak. Multiple targets, Porter said. Different altitudes, different headings. Smith stared into the black windshield. No moon, no stars. The Japanese had chosen this night for a reason. Darkness was their shield. They didn't know it was about to become their enemy. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin engines roared. The Black Widow climbed into the void, not hunting with eyes, but with radio waves and trust. Every mile closed burned fuel. Every decision narrowed the margin between survival and sacrifice. Somewhere ahead, the first bomber was flying straight and level, confident, unaware, already dead. Smith leaned into the climb. The hunt had begun. The radar blip steadied at 4 miles. Smith couldn't see a thing outside the canopy, just endless, black, thick clouds, swallowing any hint of horizon. This was the kind of darkness Japanese crews trusted, the kind that made them believe they were alone. Behind Smith, Philip Porter leaned closer to his scope, reading the subtle movement of light like a language only he understood. Bearing 035. Altitude 8,000. Closing. Smith adjusted course by instinct and training small corrections, smooth hands. Too sharp, and he'd overshoot. Too slow, and the bomber would slip past him forever. Fuel ticked away with every second. The Black Widow climbed steadily, engines humming with restrained violence. At 2 miles, Smith switched to his own radar display. A single glowing mark appeared, faint, then stronger. The enemy was there, real, unaware. The Japanese bomber flew straight and level, disciplined, confident. No evasive movement, no warning radar, no idea death was sliding in behind it, silent and unseen. Smith eased closer. 1,000 yards, 800, 600. Then finally he saw it. A shadow against darker clouds. Exhaust flames flickering like dying embers. 7 men inside that aircraft, believing the night still belonged to them. Smith felt no hatred, no triumph, just focus. He slipped the Black Widow beneath the bomber's tail, slightly low, perfectly aligned. The gun sight glowed faintly, steady as a heartbeat. 4 cannons, 800 rounds. He wouldn't need many. Range 400, Porter said quietly. Smith centered the target. Breathed once, then squeezed the trigger. The night exploded. Red tracers tore forward, ripping through wing and fuel tank. For a fraction of a second, the bomber existed, then it became fire. The right wing vanished in a white-orange flash. The aircraft rolled, burning, falling. Smith pulled away as the wreck plunged toward the ocean, lighting the clouds like a funeral torch. 1 bomber down. He checked the gauges. Fuel already dropping faster than he wanted. 11 enemy aircraft still flying. And the night was far from over. The fireball vanished into the ocean, and with it went any illusion of time. Smith didn't celebrate. He didn't look back. His eyes dropped instantly to the fuel gauge, already down more than he'd planned. 1 kill had cost him precious minutes, and minutes were the only thing standing between the airfields and disaster. More contacts, Porter said. No urgency, just facts. Multiple, still inbound. Smith turned south, pushing the Black Widow harder. The engines responded, but every extra knot drank fuel at an unforgiving rate. Somewhere ahead, another bomber was closing on Murrow, flying steadily toward men who had no idea how close death was. This was the cruel reality of night fighting. You could do everything right and still lose the war, one bomber at a time. The second contact appeared